I would say nature. I don't say God. Of course, God does not decide that so many pregnancies are not carried to full term. Nature knows, in the case of our species, as with every other mammal and primate, that some fetuses are not going to make it and flushes them out. That's just a brute fact. We wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case, because we're, as you know, adapted biologically to an environment we've abandoned, the savanna. That's why we have appendices that are designed for grass eaters, and you know all of this. It's all very well knowable. You can't be having a brood of sickly, half-baked children and get away from the predators. I mean, so nature is the great abortifacient. I certainly don't blame God for it. I do, as a humanist, believe that the concept unborn child is a real one, and I think the concept is underlined by all the recent findings of embryology, about the early viability of a well-conceived human baby, the one that isn't going to be critically deformed, or even some that are, will be able to survive outside the womb earlier and earlier and earlier. And I see that date only being pushed back, and I feel a responsibility to consider the occupant of the womb as a candidate member of society in the future, and thus to say that it cannot be only the responsibility of the woman to decide upon it, that it's a social question and an ethical and a moral one. And I say this as someone who has no supernatural belief. So your question ought to have been this: how do I have any ethical opinions, since I don't believe that I'm created? And I don't believe I'm going to heaven.
I prefer the first question, if you don't mind.
Right, but okay. But I mean, it just isn't it entailed by it? I appeal to the audience. Have I not answered the question about the termination of pregnancy? Which bit have I not answered? You better prompt me then.
I'll read it again. Why is it that, according to you, when God plays God by taking a life prematurely?
Well, it isn't according to me. I don't say God does that.
Nature does. In your book, which is right over here, you have an entire chapter about the atrocities in the Old Testament.
Yes.
And the atrocities have to do with God commanding genocide and those things. And you obviously have a problem with that, as many people should. So my question again is, why, according to you, when God plays God by taking a life prematurely in the Old Testament, is it a moral outrage, but when you play God by taking a life prematurely through an abortion, it is a moral right?
Well, once again, I'm sorry if my work is so obscure, but I don't say that I have a moral right to terminate a pregnancy. I've given all the reasons that I think hedge that question ethically and morally very sternly, very stringently. And in any case, it's not like saying that every living child of the Amalekites should be destroyed. And an injunction by God to Moses to say he's been too merciful and he's spared too many children and enslaved too few women and didn't make the genocide complete. I'm sorry, I've never been accused of, and I expect not to be, if I'm lucky enough in my life, of any such thing. And the idea that there's a moral equivalence between the two, or handling the really difficult question of an unviable fetus and what should be done about it, isn't a moral equivalence at all.
So do you want to say that all unborn life is, like you say in the book, is a human being, and therefore you should not kill it? Is that what you want to say to get out of this dilemma, or what do you want to say?
No, but I think the presumption that I've long said that the presumption is that the unborn entity has a right on its side, and that every effort should be made to see if it can be preserved. And I think that's an ethical imperative. What I do say in the book is I think the Roman Catholic Church makes this argument immoral when it could be a moral one, by saying that contraception is not to be allowed, by saying that contraception is the moral equivalent of abortion. In other words, to say that contraception is also murder, which is a nonsensical and disproportionate position. I quote some serious Catholics in my book. William F. Buckley, the late, is one. Clare Booth Luce is another, by saying, if the Church says that contraception and abortion are morally the same, it degrades the opposition to abortion. And by making absurd arguments, as it has in the past, Aquinas believed that every single sperm contained a microembryo inside it, and thus that, if you like, I hope I don't offend anyone, hand jobs are genocide. As for blowjobs, don't start. that an ectopic pregnancy, in other words, a direct threat to the life of the mother, a fallopian tube pregnancy, is, instead of a direct threat to the life of the mother and an obvious no-starter for a human embryo, because that's going anyway, is someone who should be allowed to vote. This is nonsense. It's casuistry, it's immoral, it's superstition, and it prevents people from thinking seriously about matters that humanism can decide for itself, for heaven's sake, without any supernatural intervention.
Your question, sir.
Oh, well, since I answered your last question with a question of my own, I'll make it my question to you. I'm very keen to know how it is that you, in a sense, that you dare to say that without a belief in religion, I would have no source for ethical or moral.
It's not what I'm
beliefs.
saying.
You seem to hint at it.
No.
Did he not?
No. Oh, I'm not saying you don't know morality, Christopher. I'm saying you can't justify morality without a being beyond yourself.
So that, just if I, okay, good. So that if I say that for me it's enough to be willing to love my fellow man and perhaps hope that my fellow man and woman will give me some of the same consideration in return, and that, after all, the Samaritan, of whom we've all heard, was the only one to help after the priests and the Levites had passed by. And the Samaritan also, though he's talked of by Jesus, can't have been a Christian because he appears in a story told by Jesus, so there can't be any Christianity before that. Somehow, he knew the moral thing to do is to help his fellow person without a religious instruction.
Yes,
that's actually the whole point of the parable, though it's not the way it's usually told.
And that's what Christianity teaches. You know morality. It's written on your heart. You don't need the scripture to know right from wrong.
And this was only available to us 2,000 years ago.
No, you've known it from the beginning of time. Conscience has been on humanity from forever.
You'll have to let me press you a little bit on that. I mean, William Ewart Gladstone spent a huge amount of his life, and he was a great scholar of Latin and Greek, showing that every one of the Greek Socratic and other moral precepts, all they were just prefigurations of Christianity. These are the best the Greeks could do before Jesus arrived.
No.
Because he couldn't face the idea that these solidarities and moralities and understandings are innate in people and don't require divine permission. I just have to ask you, if you could do it plainly, which side do you come down on? Do you think we need divine permission to act humanly to each other?
No, it has nothing to do with permission. It has to do with the ontological category known as morality. Where does morality come from? Does it come from the benzene molecule, the carbon molecule, the oxygen molecule? In your worldview, where does it come from?
Suppose that we were having this discussion before the existence of molecules was understood.
It's irrelevant.
No, it's not, because the discussion about where does the good come from was being conducted before Lucretius developed the atomic theory, before Democritus and Epicurus, I should better say, understood that the whole world was made up of atoms and molecules. Before that was known, people were arguing, why do we behave one way to our fellows, and we call it good, and another way, and we call it wicked?
Because it's written
on... I don't think you can build in a molecular distraction to this.
I don't have the molecular problem, you do. So you're a materialist. I'm trying to ask you, where does morality come from in a materialistic worldview?
Well, did I not just acquit myself of that charge and say that the argument precedes the knowledge of the atomic and molecular structure?
No, it doesn't. No.
Not that I think, by the way, that the atomic and molecular structure is irrelevant, and it could be that we might find out that there are, who knows, pheromones or other phenomena that do have an influence on our moral conditioning. This still wouldn't, to a morally normal person, relieve them of the responsibility of saying that I feel I know what's right. I feel that some things my children don't need to be told. They already know.
Let me interject here and just ask a question another way.
Whereas to tell a child, you go to this church, which means you'll go to heaven, but your little playmates don't go to that church, and therefore will go to hell, seems to be an unpleasant thing to be saying. But
yes, that is.
Maybe I'm in a minority then.